This one's called the Aquarian Tide. It references quite a lot, this article, which you can get in the back. It references quite a lot, an article by H.P. Blavatsky, again, written toward the end of her life in French, in a theosophical publication in French. And her article is called The New Cycle, which is referenced. There are quite a few quotes in this article from that article of hers. And the reason and it was written toward the end of her life, and the reason it's entitled The New Cycle is because we're in a new cycle. These different ages, like the Piscean Age, the Aquarian Age, quite apart from what people think they are, they're actually periods of time in history that correlate with astronomical data. There's a precise number, which I don't have in my head, but these ages, like Piscean Age, Aquarian Age, they're roughly 2,500 year periods. There's a precise number, which I've forgotten, but it's actually 2,500 in X years, right down to the minute, if you want to do it that way, if you're an astronomer. So it's got to do with the position of the Earth and the Sun relative to other astronomical things. And so in this sense, these ages really exist, quite apart from what human beings, how they interpret them or what they think they are. The astronomical part of it is a given. Now the Piscean Age, so-called, because it has to do with Pisces, the Piscean Age began roughly, but someone like my teacher could tell you the exact year, but it began roughly 500 BC. And it's going to go 2,500 years plus. In 500 BC, the beginning of the Piscean Age, so-called, you had Plato, you had Pythagoras, you had Buddha, you had Lao Tse, you had Confucius. All those more or less simultaneously. And 500 years later, you had Jesus and Muhammad. So the beginning of the Piscean Age had basically the figures responsible for most of the world's religions today. And no one since. No one since. There have been a lot of claimants since. But there's no one since then that's made the kind of impact of the people I just mentioned on humanity. And that age ended, the Piscean Age so-called, astronomically it ended in 1902. Or to put it differently, the Aquarian Age began in 1902, and if you got someone who is a little better on detail than I am, they could tell you the actual date on which it began, because it actually began on a date. Get the astronomical one. Now, some of you have heard some of this before, but which is fine. There's nothing new under the sun. So I'm certainly not going to say anything new. And in the 14th century, a Buddhist teacher named Tsongkhapa, among other things, he started what we know of as the Dalai Lama tradition. He said, I'm going to establish this position, which we call the Dalai Lama, and it's going to go for 700 years. And it's going to be the same being every time for 700 years. And if you can imagine what it would be for a being, there are beings in the world that can make a 700-year commitment. See, it's like almost off the chart. So there's been a Dalai Lama for 700 years, and there's one right now who, when asked, are you the last one or not, by people who know it was started by Tsongkhapa for 700 years, well, 700 years is up. So the Dalai Lama has repeatedly been asked, are you the last one? And he won't say, or hasn't said. and, at least publicly. So the Tsongkhapa started the Dalai Lama tradition in the 14th century for 700 years. He also started a tradition wherein representatives, for lack of a better word, of what's been called the Brotherhood of Bodhisattvas, the Lodge of Mahatmas, enlightened beings. Tsongkhapa started a tradition wherein one or more such beings would appear in the West in the last 25 years of each century, starting with the 14th, in the West. And if you took the time, which you needn't do, but if you took the time to go back to the 14th century in the West and take a look at who's shown up in the West in the last 25 years of each century since then, and you actually noticed who showed up and the impact what their showing up had on their time and subsequent times, it's all traceable. It's all traceable. And some of the most prominent figures in Western thought are involved in this, what's called the seven impulsions. Because the West in the 14th century was in bad shape when Tsongkhapa started. The West needed spiritual knowledge because we're talking the times of the Inquisition. That's what was happening. That's what was available to human beings in the West. Nothing. Hence these 7 impulsions. And if you're interested in that, the book I mentioned earlier called the Great Teachers series has articles on these various individuals. And the one in the 19th century, which would be the 6th out of 7, the one in the 19th century was H.P. Blavatsky, who never made a claim at all on her own behalf. She said she's just serving her teacher. And her writings are largely the reason people like us know about karma. We've heard the word, we've heard of reincarnation. We all have heard of things like all of this is somehow reducible to light. Some of us have heard that Einstein's niece mentioned to somebody that the only book on his desk for the whole of his adult life, very well read, was Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, which is her monumental work. Not easy to read, but Einstein claimed through studying that he was able to come up with what he came up with, relativity theory. So H.P. Blavatsky, like most great beings, she was scandalized and libeled and slandered, and the usual stuff that happens to a real being when they try to help us, bring us some light. And she said at one point that she said, I'm merely preparing the way for one much greater than myself. And this is in 1875 to 1892 when she passed away. So she's writing and producing the influences that she produced at the very end of the Piscean Age, which, as we say, ended in 1902. So she's kind of like on the threshold of the Aquarian Age, and her influence, and you just have to take my word for it, but it's researchable. Her influence was awesome. And quite apart from the traceable physical influences. So then comes she passes away in 1891, having said she's preparing the way for one much greater than she. And the Aquarian Age begins in 1902, whatever that is, the Aquarian Age. And Blavatsky had said in this article, The New Cycle, which is quoted, as I said in this article. And this is where we have to kind of forget what we think we know for an hour, and because this is a huge picture now that we're going to be discussing. The Aquarian Tide has to do with the whole of humanity, the article. It's got to do with humanity as a whole. It's got to do with what's happening with humanity as a whole, what has been happening, what is happening, what will be happening. The whole article has to do with humanity as a whole. And what's, to put it really crudely, what's the trip? What's going on with humanity as a whole, evolutionarily speaking? And not evolutionarily speaking in the physical sense of evolutionary, but evolutionary in terms of the mind of humanity, the heart of humanity. What's the new cycle that she calls her article? What's this new cycle she's talking about? And the new cycle she's talking about is what's otherwise known as the Aquarian Age, which is the new cycle, 2,500 years, started in 1902. And like the start of the Piscean Age, 500 BC, where you had a number of figures appearing on the Earth simultaneously, at the start of the Aquarian Age, there was only one that appeared. And that was this man named Ayer, who wrote, on whose talk this article is based, the transcription of a talk he gave. And I know this is a bit off the chart, but it doesn't matter because it is what it is. He struck the keynote for the Aquarian Age. And if you read this article, just the first page of the article, it talks about this 700-year cycle of some wisdom being brought to the West in the last 25 years of each century, relative to the Aquarian Age cycle. It says in the article, referring to these efforts started by Tsongkhapa, it says, the culmination of this effort, adjusting the entire range of human principles, was planned in the 14th century. The culmination of this effort, adjusting the entire range of human principles, was planned to coincide with the avataric impulse accompanying the Aquarian Age, profoundly affecting the future races of humanity. So if you take this article at face value, what it's saying is that this man, Ayer, was giving the impulse and doing whatever it is that's done on other planes that's going to affect the next 2,500 years of the planet. And if you read this article, you could say, well, how's it going to affect the next 2,500 years? What's the deal? Where is humanity? And in answer to that, the article starts, or after the first page, it starts by pointing out what's going to die. Because the beginning of the Aquarian Age, which say would be the next, started in 1902, say it's the next 250 years. Because you're talking the next 2,500. So the next 250 or 200 or whatever, that's not specified in the article, but it's, large changes don't happen overnight. Like cultures and societies and institutions, they don't disintegrate and dissipate and disappear overnight. It's a slow process, which you can learn by reading something like Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it took it a long time to rise, it took it a long time to fall. They don't just suddenly everything's different. But what the article says in the early parts of the article is that the institutions as we know them in America, but also in other cultures, they're all going to change. And they're going to change for the better. And you could say, well, I don't know, man. We've got global warming. We've got too many people. You know, we got all this stuff going on. You know, the pole Arctic ice cap is melting. And we've got immigrants who want to come in here and work cheap. You know, all this stuff going on. How can they say be optimistic about the future? Because the future is optimistic. And there's about 2 pages of this article devoted to what he refers to as a small minority of humanity, who, it says, for karmic reasons, are scared to death of the future because they know they don't have one, but they don't know it consciously. So, but they control the media. And they control the electronic media. And what they're pushing, because of their relatively conscious or unconscious deep fear of the future, which is bright, of which they somehow know they're not going to be a part, which for those of you who believe in reincarnation implies that, you know, it's possible to lose the ability to obtain a human form. If you use it unwisely long enough, you won't be able to get one, but you'll want one. You know, that's called hell. You know, you want to have a human form, you want to be able to learn, or you want sentient experience, and you can't get it because you blew it too many times in a row. You just went the other way. So you got this small minority of mankind who's afraid of the light. It's that thing I mentioned before. I can understand why children are afraid of the dark, but I can't understand why adults are afraid of the light. So you got adults who are afraid of the light and they control the media. And you can read the article for yourself since it's been reproduced, so I won't go into the details. But the bottom line points out that those who are dispensing, you know, information to us, basically the information is negative and fatalistic. They're not dispensing any hope. You know, it's not a hope. You don't get hope when you watch the nightly news. You know. And you don't get hope, you know, out here in the culture. It's either all about me or it's all about doom. And this is called, Gandhi called it a vast hypnotizing machine. Now, this has gone into in some detail, all the way from nihilistic literature. Nihilism means basically belief in nothing. So you got nihilistic literature appearing, as the article says, as early as the last part of the 19th century. It names the different countries that have expressed this fear and where it's manifested in different ways, this fear of a light. And this includes things like a lot of existential literature is based upon fear. All this negative, you know, no exit, you're doomed, you know, waiting for Godot, you know, and art that makes no sense at all, but it's supposed to, so you nod, oh, that's cool. There's nothing there. It's just nihilistic, it's random. Just throw some paint on a canvas and put it up on a wall, and a fellow nihilist will review it, you know, and suddenly it's great art. And of course the culture, or to stick to America, he says all of these symptoms are worse in America, but the interesting thing he says is that this is where the Renaissance is going to occur, but probably not during our lifetimes. But maybe our children's or our children's children. if they're lucky. So there's a bit of discussion of the crudeness of this culture. And the fact that very few people are in control of everything. And that most of the people in control of everything are not known to us. Because the people that are known to us are just the fronts for the people that aren't known to us. And that's kind of like elementary. More and more people are aware of this. Now the good news is, according to this article, is that more and more people are starting to see through it. Especially the new generation of so-called indigo children. They're just seeing through it. There's nothing to it. There's nothing there. It's not about what you own, or how much you own, or how much power you have, or what gender you are, or what race you're in, or what kind of job you have, or where you come from, or where you're going to, or who you know or who you don't know. All that stuff exists, but it's irrelevant to more and more young people. There was awareness of it during the Summer of Love in 1967. What if the whole earth was that way? Just love. You know, nothing to prove. Everyone's kind of interesting. Everybody's got a story. Listen to various stories, you know. There was one enlightened being who lived in the 20th century, on whom we had a talk a long time ago, named Asura Devi. And her picture of the ideal condition was everybody eat their food in a contented, thankful manner, and then just go wander about. Just wander about. Now this Aquarian Tide, according to Blavatsky and Ayer, who's responsible for this article, this Aquarian Tide is going to bring together two things. On the one hand, there's what's called fanatical religion, spiritual materialism. It's a very interesting concept. Spiritual materialism. What the heck's that? Spiritual materialism is if I think I'm being spiritual because I go to a certain place at certain times every week and hear certain kinds of words and sing certain kinds of songs and pray certain kinds of prayers, and I'm doing this so I can go to heaven. The materialism part is wanting to go to heaven, wanting something out of it. It's kind of like going to work and getting a paycheck, going to church, get saved. It's ridiculous. It's spiritual materialism. And it's terrible, and it's gray, and there are people making billions of dollars off it. Billions. It's a billion-dollar industry, saving people. Letting people think they're saved. I'm going to heaven because I gave 15% a month, and because the pastor told me I was. Spiritual materialism. How do you get over spiritual materialism, according to the article? You get over it by doing whatever your spiritual life is for the sake of the whole, not for the sake of yourself. So as the article says, you know, you might believe in all these concepts like karma, reincarnation, et cetera, but it says you're going to find, if you are in earnest, you're going to find that there are aspects of your nature that are still caught up in spiritual materialism, that want something out of this deal. So we have to get over what's been called the dire heresy of separateness. That's a big, tall order. You mean I got to get over the idea that I exist independent of you? Yeah. If you want to get over spiritual materialism, it says we have to get over the concept that we're separate from others in reality. Because we're not. if you think of nature, which most people think of as out there, not noticing that we're a part of it. We're part of what's happening. And if you think about nature, and our sciences have gotten so this is kind of like self-evident to them, nature is one huge interacting whole. It's all interacting with itself all the time. And now that we have things like, you know, physics and movies like What the Bleep Do We Know? I mean, just the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? I mean, here it is, it's just being available all over the place, and ordinary people like you and me are going in to see it. And it's showing us a whole new reality compared to the one we learned in school, compared to the one we're still learning in school. We're still pushing the old ideas in school, but the kids are going to see What the Bleep Do We Know, and they're saying, what the hell has this got to do with what I'm learning in school? And the answer is nothing. Welcome to the Aquarian Age, symptom of which is movies like What the Bleep Do We Know? Now, I'm not just pushing a movie. The ideas in the movie have to do with the idea of a separative self as an illusion. And we can almost prove it now. And the good news in the article is that it says that more and more beings are going to be born who can see through the illusion at an earlier age and get on to the real thing. And what's the real thing? According to the article, the real thing is the thing in us, is the aspect of ourselves that strikes us as being the most real. Because we've all got something in ourselves that we think that we know is the most real aspect of ourselves. And sometimes we'll share it with somebody, but not usually, which is good. But a lot of our life is just fluff. But once in a while, we all get a moment where we realize this is the real part. It might be some simple thing like giving someone $1 who's homeless. That's 10 times more real than getting a raise at work. 10 times more real. So being true to the real part of ourselves is where the journey begins. But to be true to the real part of oneself is to start noticing all the parts of oneself that aren't real, that need to be taken in hand. Because they're not going to go away by themselves. The parts of ourselves that are unreal, the parts of ourselves that get in the way of the parts of ourselves that we know that are real, because once in a while we get in touch with it. Well, how do we stay in touch with it? That's the question. How do we stay in touch with our real part that we all sense from time to time? And how to do that is, well, you got to focus upon it, the real part. Without drawing attention to oneself in the process. Like, hey, I'm paying attention to the real part of myself. Not if you're talking that way or not. Because those words have nothing to do with the real part. Matter of fact, the more we learn to concentrate and pay attention to what we call ourself, the more we discover that most of what we call ourself is not very real. And much of what we call ourself is actually aspects of it that get in our way. Which goes back to the question, how do we stay in touch with the real part of ourselves more of the time? So it's not, our ideals are not just something we believe. Oh yeah, I believe in karma. I believe in reincarnation. Well, what's it doing for you? I mean, have you thought about karma? Have you thought about reincarnation? If you believe in reincarnation, not you, but if a person says, I believe in reincarnation, if they actually believed in reincarnation, it would affect what they're doing today. Because the next life isn't separate from the one we're in right now. So if you wonder what's my next life going to be like, it's going to be like the causes we're creating right now. And the main cause we're all creating because we haven't started to think for ourselves because of our karma. And part of our karma, most of us, is go to an educational system which doesn't encourage you to think for yourself or even tell you that you can. It's too busy giving you answers instead of questions. So you grow up and you get the answers. So then you don't have to question anymore. You just watch the TV news, movies, listen to the helplessness, hopelessness, negativity that's being spewed out on the media. Get sucked into, some people think it's a conspiracy. Oh, it's all a conspiracy. In a way it is. You got to see through it. You have to see through what's being peddled as reality. And it's being peddled by people who are scared to death, which is why they're not happy, which is why they drink too much and take too many drugs. I mean, I grew up with some of these people. I've seen how they live. They're running the goddamn world, and they can't stand their own company. And they don't want to hear about reincarnation or karma. They don't want to hear about no separative self. They sure as hell aren't interested in light. Now this sounds negative, but it's not. It's just where it's at. And the article says, to use a biblical phrase, which is not in the article, come ye out and be separate. Come ye out and be separate. Come out of the collective hallucination and get in touch with yourself. The part of you that's real. We all know that part. There's a part of us that's real. Maybe it hasn't surfaced since we were little kids, but it's still there. So the article says that in the 20th century, and also our current one, 21st, there's going to be a battle. In the 19th century, the battle was between materialistic religion, or spiritual materialism, on the one hand, and what he calls soulless materialism of science. Because in the 19th century, science was everything reduced to matter, or matter in motion. And that's all there was. It's just matter, and somehow or another it's evolved to this point. But there's a denial of any spiritual reality. And then the fanatical religiosity people, they're fighting the soulless materialism. It's still going on. I mean, evolution has to be taught the book of Genesis has to be taught in schools in Kansas, along with evolution. But the two are supposedly fighting with each other, the people. Everything's been this way since God created it. Evolution's a myth. And then you got the other people saying it's all a matter of matter evolving and spirituality is a myth. So supposedly you got these two forces, and you still do, and to some degree in the West especially, you still got these two forces battling with each other. You got materialistic sciences saying Orthodox religion is a bunch of hogwash, and you got the Orthodox religion claiming that science is evil, and citing things like the atomic bomb as an example. Now Blavatsky says this battle between spiritual materialism and the soulless materialism of then science, and the article says this, that this dichotomy, this so-called battle, is like it's an illusion. It's an illusion. It's like this isn't the case, but it's almost as though somebody above both battles put it out there to get people into one camp or the other. And the reality is not both camps are ridiculous. Now, science is aware of this today. Science is no longer materialistic because they've actually studied what we called matter to the point where it turns into pure light. So materialistic science is no longer really a relevant phrase. And then you get back to examples like what the bleep do we know? You know, there's nothing material. You know, most of the great scientists of the 20th century didn't even believe in matter as some kind of bottom line particle, because they've yet to find a bottom line particle. So science is no longer materialistic, but religion, unfortunately, still embodies spiritual materialism. There's still a lot of people who want to go to heaven, or don't want to go to hell, or both. You know, some people are more focused on not going to hell, and some are more focused on getting to heaven. And both represent materialism in the sense that they both assume there's someone to get one place or the other. They're both assuming the existence of an entity which is separate from everybody else. And that's the materialism, spiritual materialism. In other words, most of us are spiritually materialistic because we're looking for what's in it for us. Or we're non-spiritually materialistic and we're interested in how to get a bigger paycheck so we can buy more matter. I like that matter over at Macy's, you know. So we collect matter. You know, so some of us are materialistic in that sense. You know, we have storage places to store the matter that we're not currently interested in. You know, but we don't want to get rid of it, so we got a storage unit we can visit. You know, hang out there on the weekends, have a few brewskis, stare at our matter. It's funny, but the sad thing is it's true. You know. So some of us are materialistic in the sense of, you know, we're into the getting and spending thing, as Shakespeare put it. And some of us are spiritually materialistic, and most of us are both. So if we wanted to get real, we'd have to take a look at the aspects of ourselves that are looking for what's in it for me, and doing that through some so-called spiritual thing. Probably none of us in this room are, you know, denizens of the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County, for example. But there may be those of us in this room that are living our life in terms of what's in it for me, which is the spiritual materialism. It's hard to get over ourselves. That's the problem. And our self-interest. Now the good news in the article is that the dichotomy between, to put it crudely, evolution on the one hand and Orthodox religion on the other, that dichotomy, says Blavatsky and Iyer, is a false dichotomy. It's really two sides of the same coin. And the coin itself is from the Piscean Age. It's done. You know, the spiritual materialism, what's in it for me, it's over, says the article. And you say, well, it doesn't look like it's over to me. No, it doesn't look like it's over because it's going to take it time to die. But it's dying. You can say, well, but church membership is greater than it's ever been. True, but that's a sign that it's dying. It's a sign that it's dying. Again, you know, look at Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. I mean, there are people who knew it was dying when it hadn't quite peaked out yet. But there are people who knew this thing's over. But it might take 300 years for it to absolutely be over. The article says that there's one colonializing country left on Earth, and that's the United States. And it's over. The man who wrote this article, or gave the talk on which his article is based, said that in 1976, when America celebrated its 200th year, the most striking feature of that 200-year celebration is that Americans didn't know what they were celebrating. They'd lost track of the ideal, which all men are created equal. It doesn't look that way to me. We don't teach you that in school. We might make you say the Pledge of Allegiance, but we don't teach you that all men are created equal. You know, the guy who's a different color, different religion, you know, radical equality. That's what the hippies had for about 10 months before the press got hold of it and turned it upside down. So radical equality is a mark of will be a mark of the Aquarian Age, according to this article. And you can see little glimpses of it with some of the young people coming in now. There's kind of a radical equality. I mean, there isn't much ego going on, and they see through all this layer of veils upon the real. And the article says that basically the whole reference is to divine wisdom, or just wisdom. And the article implies rather clearly that whatever wisdom is, it's changeless. It's not different now from what it was in the days of Pythagoras, or Confucius, or Krishna. It's kind of like saying the obvious, reality is reality. The surface changes, you know, the institutions change, everything changes on the surface. But, I mean, an example that we can all relate to is like gravity's gravity. It's never been different. You know, gravity doesn't change because something called progress happens. Or gravity doesn't change because something called disintegration happens. It's just a constant. So they're constants. There are things that don't change, and that's wisdom, the changeless. And the thing that doesn't change that we all know a little bit about, even just from things like what the bleep do we know, one thing that doesn't change is light and the speed of light. It doesn't change. So for example, I used to think this when I was just kind of starting to think at all, that, you know, if Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad and Plato and Pythagoras and Krishna, you can continue to name such beings, if they all got together in the same room, they have absolutely nothing to disagree over. And they'd all know the same thing. They don't know the same thing. It's like getting a bunch of physicists together, you know, who all know about the law of gravity. So if we got a bunch of enlightened beings together, to the extent to which they're enlightened, they all know the same thing. And that's the hope, according to the article, of the Aquarian Age, is that more and more people are going to have the ideal as what their minds are focused upon, in spite of the evidence. Like Ayer said to people that you have to believe in spite of the evidence, he said. Because the evidence that we're being given is the evidence that somebody's decided they want us to have. The article points out very strongly that most of the people on the earth are unheard. And most people on the earth are not on a negative bummer. It's just we don't hear about it. So the article stresses that it's not a question of science versus religion. That's a false kind of, as I said, two sides of the same coin, opposite sides of the same coin. The real battle, the article says, is between spiritual materialism and soulless materialism, i.e. orthodox religion and materialistic science on the one hand, and what the article calls philosophy and mysticism on the other hand. That's the real struggle. And the article says that philosophy and mysticism, and then it says, i.e., the wisdom religion, the wisdom of the ages. And what the heck's that? Well, the article puts it very simply, and it was a motto, the motto of the Theosophical Society that H.P. Blavatsky started that failed to do what she wanted it to do, or what the enlightened beings behind her wanted it to do. It failed. She said so in her own lifetime, that it hadn't succeeded. But the motto of that Theosophical Society that she started was, there's no religion higher than truth. And that's what the Aquarian Age gradually will come to see. That the ideal is truth. And there's no religion higher than truth. Which means most of the religions, certainly the Western ones, not the at their core, but the way they've evolved. There's, if there's no religion higher than truth, then most so-called religion is going to have to go. Because truth is the only thing there is than which there's nothing higher. And what's the truth? Well, that's why you might want to read something like Key to Theosophy. You won't get the truth there, but you'll get some ways to think about things that'll move the mind toward broader standpoints, less personal standpoints. The article says that if we come in contact with these ideas, number one, we're very fortunate karmically. Because at the moment, these ideas are not exactly what most people are being taught. So it's fortunate to come in contact with such ideas. And if our minds are in the right place, that would be a reason to be quite grateful. Wow, I have the privilege of being able to learn what the wise have always tried to teach. It says that if a person comes across some of these teachings when they're young, that's about as good as what we call karma gets. Because if I'm a young person and I know or I believe, and I read the article like this, that I'm at the threshold of a whole new age, which is going to last 2,500 years, and that I in this life could make causes that will positively affect subsequent lives. That's quite a thing to learn if you're 16, 17, 18 years old, and you have the rest of your life to pursue the real part of oneself. And then it says, what about, it doesn't say this, but what about us old folks? We're just coming across these ideas now, as we're like 40, 50, 60 years old. It says, what a great privilege, because it's never too late to get going. Because this article, apart from the vast perspective, it's all about getting going. How do I get going? Toward the real, toward thinking of humanity as a whole rather than me and fellow Venturians or something. How do I become what Socrates called a citizen of the world? Through self-reformation, the article says. We have to reform ourselves, which simply put, and probably too simply put, we have to take the aspects of ourselves that we suspect aren't doing us any good and aren't doing anybody else any good, and we have to get control of them. And if we're Well, the article refers to people at the top of their field in physics. We're talking contemporary now. Top of their field in physiology, top of their field in embryology, top of their field in psychology. What can we learn from studying the people who are at the tops of their fields? What do they say? They say that they're just barely getting a little teeny glimpse of something that's much faster than they have a clue about. In other words, the very best thinkers in virtually every field are the most humble people you'll ever meet, because they know just enough to know that they know virtually nothing relative to what's there to be known. Like Einstein, a humble human being. And he wasn't trying to be humble. He was humbled by the vastness of which he understood so little. It's also pointed out in the article that it's a good article to read, as I said before. I mean, just assume, as you're reading, or just if you want to read the article, just assume, as philosophers say, for purposes of discussion, just assume that whatever or whoever is behind this article is a fully enlightened being. And this is what they have to say about the Aquarian Tide. And just read it. Say, okay, here, if you're Christian, say Jesus is saying this. Or if you're Buddhist, say Buddhist saying this. It doesn't matter. Just give it some credibility long enough to read. And, you know, your life could change. It's like inserting oneself into the whole vast trip. And the article says, so the spiritual life doesn't have to do with believing a bunch of things. It doesn't have to do with going certain places, certain times. It's just got to do with our everyday lives. And it says if there's some people, well, ultimately the spiritual life, according to this article, involves the development of concentration. You know, it's necessary to learn to concentrate. We're not taught how to do this in school. You know, just concentrate the mind. And it's necessary to learn what the article calls spiritual attention. Paying attention to spiritual things, ideals. And it says, if the object is to learn to concentrate and pay spiritual attention to oneself and others, it won't take very long to discover that one can't concentrate very long or hold one's attention on some abstract idea very long. It says some people can do it effortlessly and other people can maybe concentrate on something for 5 minutes. And the article says it doesn't matter how long you can or cannot concentrate. What matters is what's behind the effort. A sincerely felt effort being made on behalf of humanity, not on behalf of me, is as good as someone who can concentrate without effort for hours, but bringing the wrong motive to it. So it's not like, oh, I can only concentrate for 5 minutes. Good. Do it. And the other thing is there's no religion higher than truth, which we don't have. And we're not wise beings. Or maybe we are. Maybe there's some hiding out in here, you know, appearing to be Venturians, you know. Actually, one just rode by before the class here on a bicycle, you know, with a dog, pulling a dog and a dog thing and a baby thing. He cruised by, he stopped, we chatted for a little while, he cruised down the street. There's someone who doesn't need to hear this talk. They're around. There are a couple things I do want to mention. It does say here that several of these quotes from H.P. Blavatsky are pretty hard-hitting. I'll just read you this one because it has to do with there's no religion higher than truth. This is a quote from H.P. Blavatsky in the New Cycle article I mentioned earlier. Everyone fanatically clinging to an idea isolating him from the universal axiom, there is no religion higher than truth. Everyone fanatically clinging to something that separates the person from that axiom will find himself separated like a rotten plank from the new ark called humanity. That's like a prophecy. Like, the truth is, if you're going to worship anything, make it be the truth, as you see it, or as you've been taught it by any great teacher. They all taught the same thing, in spite of the fact that we have, in the West, religions warring against each other. All the great teachers taught the same thing. It's kind of like wherever you take physics on the planet, you're going to be taught the same thing. That's kind of hopeful. There's a lot of hope for the future, according to this article. But maybe not the immediate future. Maybe you and I are going to have to live through what was called the death throes of a dying culture. But we don't have to get caught up. Nietzsche, who's not exactly a beacon of light, but Nietzsche did talk about what he called the naysayers. The naysayers. There are always people around who want to say, nay, no, that can't work. No, these ideas are all very good, but humanity is going to make itself extinct. Yeah. Naysayers. So to get on to start swimming with the tide of the Aquarian tide is necessary to get away from the naysaying standpoint. It's not all going to hell, but maybe some particular aspects of it are. They're doomed. You know, it's going to be over. Like it's already the case that a lot of people are not being listened to by their children. Especially now that we have things like the internet, which it doesn't matter if you like it or not, but the internet is revolutionizing the way we think about ourselves, and the way we think about others. And there's never been so much commonality in human thought as is available on what we call the internet, where everyone on the earth can tune into the same information. And there's a lot of junk on the internet which the naysayers like to point out. But the wisdom of the ages is on the internet too. And it's never been available in human history to so many people that easily. You just sit down on your home computer and you're reading Pythagoras, or you're reading Blavatsky, or you're reading Jesus, or reading Buddha. It's never been available like that, ever in human history. That's part of the Aquarian Age. Because if the man who runs this website, theosophy.org, apparently you can find out who's been to your site and where they're from. And they get hits on this theosophytrust.org site from places like Siberia. Now, 100 years ago, that wouldn't have been thinkable. So much is happening so fast, and those of you who are older know it. You know, more has happened in terms of quote-unquote progress, or unifying the whole. More has happened in the last 50 years than the last 2,500. It's moving so fast. It's moving faster than the institutions can keep up with, which is why they're basically dying. And the more I realize that everything I have invested myself in is dying, the more frantic I become. So there'll be a lot of franticness, and trying to shore up the dam, and it won't work. Because more and more people aren't going to want to have anything to do with the institutions, according to the article. The other thing the article says, by the way, it talks about the keynote of the Aquarian Age. So it's like saying, okay, the keynote of the next 2,500 years. I mean, it's hard to think this way. The keynote of the next 2,500 years is going to be, quote, absolute freedom of human thought, unquote. Absolute freedom of human thought. That's incredible. If you're born in the next 2,500 years, you're going to be born into a world where there's absolute freedom of human thought. No one's trying to control other people's thinking. Right now, we have thought control. The article mentions that phrase. We have thought control. It's institutionalized. But more and more people are not letting their thoughts be controlled. And whether you and I break out or not, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they're going to be increasingly aware of absolute freedom of human thought. And it won't be a threatening thing, absolute freedom of human thought, because there'll be nothing to threaten. There's nothing wrong with absolute freedom of human thought, unless I have something that is incompatible with it to protect. And then I'm going to be nervous at the idea of absolute freedom of human thought. I don't want those people thinking for themselves. Maybe they won't vote for me or think I'm important or buy my products or fight my wars. What if everyone knew that there's no reason to fight a war? Like they said back in the 60s, what if they gave a war and no one showed up? That could happen in the next 200 years. It could happen. I'm not interested in killing people, thank you. You're going to have to find someone else. What a radical thought, And these ideas, which are very simple, are very radical. Right now in 2007. They're radical enough so you don't hear them very many places. In the Aquarian Age, quote unquote, which is the next 2,500 years, it's not what's happening in Sedona, Arizona. The Aquarian Age has already been media-sized and trivialized. Because most people, when they think about the Aquarian Age at all, they think of things like seances or magnetism, vortexes, all this nonsense that you hear, clairvoyance, telepathy. It's got nothing to do with the Aquarian Age. That's all gray magic, and it's as old as thinking man. People have been dabbling around in that stuff for millennia, and they're dabbling around in it still. And they're the ones that are scared to death of light, which they think they're interested in. But all they're doing is going on psychic side trips. It talks about it here in the article. It says the most dangerous aspect of everything is the psychic, astral aspects. It's where all the pollution is. And if you're sensitive, if you can kind of take your mind beyond the apparent, you'll enter a realm that's very muddy. The psychic realm is very muddy. And it's been made that way purposefully. So we've already trivialized the idea of Aquarian Age and think it has something to do with the stuff that you can study in these weekend seminars and then get your little certificate of enlightenment. The Aquarian Age is vast and it's positive, and it's going to wipe out all the distinctions that we think are real. And it's going to be really quite glorious, according to this article and others. The man who is responsible for this article said that the 21st century, which we're in, will be, but we're just beginning it, the 21st century will be as heaven on earth compared to the 20th, which is the bloodiest in human history. I mean, the 20th century makes the Inquisition look like kindergarten. Millions of human beings killed in the 20th century. Forget countries, just human beings. Millions. Never anything like it in recorded history. So the 21st century will be as heaven on earth compared to that. So there's hope, you know, for those of you in this room under 20. You may end up living in an incredible world. Oh yeah, we got people in here under 20. Speaking of bodies here. I'm going to bring a couple other things here. Blavatsky, a quote from her again, from that same article. She says, H.P. Blavatsky spoke of the time, quote, when the flame of modern materialism, artificial and cold, will be extinguished for lack of fuel. Otherwise known as fewer and fewer people are going to take it seriously. And then here, speaking of shaking off the yoke of materialism, which we might decide we want to do. You know, I don't want to be into spiritual materialism. It says, it's not easy for the human soul to shake off the yoke of materialism. For even with a strong conviction in the immortal soul, one may unknowingly retain mental habits that are materialistic. So mental habits. Any concern for spiritual progress for oneself must therefore be rooted out and dispelled as a pernicious form of spiritual materialism. That's intense. If I want anything out of this deal for me, I'm just a spiritual materialist. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if I recognize it. Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, then don't. Start thinking about the real. Now, as we said earlier, the greatest minds in any field are the ones who are the humblest because they know how little they know. This includes things like music virtuosos. You know, they know that they're just barely tapping it. And it says that when we come to see how little we as an individual know, how far we have to go, because if we take a look at ourselves, it says we're going to discover all these aspects of ourselves that are not compatible with the ideal. It says when a person sees this, rather than judging themselves or saying, oh, I'm really messed up, I'll never get rid of all that, and just be humble for how little you know. Just let go and say, yeah, I don't know much, I'm just going to do the best I can. But he really stresses in this article the importance if one's trying to do something in the direction of humanity as a whole, in our thinking, rather than just me as an individual. It stresses in this article it's very important if one's attempting to move in this direction, or to put it in a devotional context, if one's attempting to become more devoted to the real teachers and to humanity, it's extremely important not to negatively judge oneself. Oh, I shouldn't be having these thoughts, or I shouldn't be doing this or that. And then because I shouldn't be an M, then I get to have a negative self-image. Well, this is just another form of materialism. Or as a man told me once, I've got a lot of education. I was hooked up for a while with a man who had a 6th grade education, who was one of the wisest beings I've met. And I was complaining to him one day about some something in my head that I didn't want to have there, and I was all obsessed with I shouldn't be thinking this way, and I don't know what to do. And this guy heard me out. He said, "So you found another way to think about yourself?" He was right. I'd found another way to think about myself, negatively. So the article stresses, if you're really trying to do something real in your life, don't beat yourself up when you fall short of the ideal. And then it goes so far as to say we actually have to, if we're attempting to love humanity, we have to realize we're a part of it. So we have to learn to love ourselves, but not in the sense that I love me and I don't like you. But we can't get, we're not doing it for real if we're holding ourselves in judgment. In this holding ourselves in judgment we won't go into, but the article does. It's kind of an offshoot of the whole idea of original sin, which has become mutated into things like Freudian theory, where the bottom line is we're all screwed. So the idea of original sin has been cleansed, and now it permeates a lot of academia, which in turn influences the masses. So all these negative things that we think about ourselves are just the offshoot of 17th century addiction to the idea of original sin. There's nothing wrong with any of us in the sense of inherent negativity or sinfulness. That's like one of the best conspiracies in human history, to get millions of people thinking that they're born with something wrong. There's nothing wrong. At the very bottom of our being, there's not some big negative thing waiting to get us. The other shoe to drop. At the core of our being is just light. These people who are peddling negative self-concepts, which are no longer, for the most part, except in churches, called original sin, but it's just become, it's just now being presented in a different way. The concept of, at my very core, there's something missing or wrong. No, at our very core, things are fine. That's what the hippies knew. That's why they're nice to policemen, and policemen are nice back. They couldn't help it, because they know this person means me no harm. Okay, just a couple more things there. Yeah. This is the part about concentration. Some people can concentrate on that which is universal and impersonal. So what are we trying to move toward? That which is universal? It's everywhere. Law of gravity is a good example. And impersonal, law of gravity is a good example. It's not out to get certain people, and other people don't have to, gravity doesn't apply to them. So some can concentrate on that which is universal and impersonal for long periods of time. Others find they cannot do so for more than a few minutes at a time. Again, the length of meaningful meditation is less important than the authenticity of the attempt. So not all, but it's very important. If our attempts are authentic, that's what counts. We really mean it. We're going to spend 5 minutes thinking about humanity in a positive sense. Make that authentic. Tie that into the part of yourself that is most real to you. And that's what counts. Not how long you meditate. Someone says, oh, I can meditate for hours. On what? You know, like Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, it's ridiculous to give things up on this plane if after you've given them up, you're still thinking about them. You haven't given them up yet. To give something up is no longer part of your thing. You've given it up. A lot of things have to be given up to be able to live increasingly in the impersonal and universal. But it's doable. No matter how bad my individual so-called day is, I can still realize that the universal and the impersonal continues to exist untainted by whether I'm in a good or a bad mood or having a so-called good or bad day. I don't know, for me it helps us to think about the law of gravity. That's why I keep using it as an example, because it's a really good example of the impersonal and the universal. And compassion, which is one of the two characteristics of enlightened beings, the other being wisdom, both compassion and wisdom are universal and impersonal, like light. It's universal, it's totally impersonal, but not in a bad way. It shines on everybody. It shines on Dalai Lama, and it shines on Hitler. That's getting pretty impersonal. It's easier to divide it up. Okay. So I'll just read a paragraph to end this. This is the last paragraph in the article. He also emphasizes the idea of becoming self-dependent. In the next 500 years, more and more people will be self-dependent, not dependent upon other people or anything outside, which is another way of saying more and more people will be attempting to be true to themselves, self-dependent. Relinquishing the mummeries of the past, people have begun to understand that only through developing the natural powers of concentration and spiritual attention can they enrich their collective future. Through the joy and the beauty, the dignity and self-respect that come from self-discipline, they can alchemically quicken their creative faculties and thereby tap the potential energies of the higher mind and heart. Thus, following the small old path depicted in every true philosophy and intimated in every authentic myth, each good and true human soul may discern the spiritual possibilities of the Aquarian Age and stay abreast of the vanguard of humanity. Thank you.